Hello everyone. How's that lighting looking? Oops, let me just get everything adjusted. Let's try this. That makes me washed out. That also makes me washed out. How about we go something like this? Nope, maybe the original plan was better. I'm still getting used to the lighting in this room. Right, this will do. Well, hello everyone. I can't see any chat. Can somebody please message me on Instagram if there is chat that I can't see? Or Facebook, doesn't matter. I can see one message from Gerard. Bonjour, Gerard. Still got a little bit of French left in me. All right, 7 people. I assume the chat is working. If it's not, somebody better message me pronto because we're getting started. So, yeah, a few updates to begin with. Just a little footnote, I guess, on something that I meant to mention in the last live episode, but didn't, just forgot to, was that the main reason that gauge conversion is seen and is often so expensive is not so much because moving a rail over is expensive, or at least it shouldn't be if you've got A, wooden sleepers, or B, gauge convertible concrete sleepers. Yeah, it's because the track often needs upgrading at the same time. So, yeah, that's sort of where the big expense comes from. Tracks that are due for gauge conversion are often rather run down. So, okay, just pronounce you Gerard without the D. We've also added 5 more gauges to the total Australia list from the last time, which I think I said that there was 15. Well, I had 30 total gauges for Australia, I believe, 15 of which were not in Victoria. Yeah, so we've added another 5 to the list, 4 of which were from John Browning, so thank you to John. And one of them was from somebody else who I didn't write the name down in time. I got all this from a Light Railways Research Society meeting. Well, that's where most of my gauges have been compiled from. But anyway, so added to the list has been 1 foot 7.5 inch or 495 mil, 1 foot 8.25 inch, 514 millimeters, 1 foot 8.5 inch, 521 millimeters, and 1 foot 11.5 inch, 597, and finally 2 foot 1.5 inch, 648 millimeters from South Australia. So yeah, another 5 gauges. Just when you thought the break of gauge problem couldn't get any worse, it did. In terms of a couple of map updates, I have updated the Cheetham, Moolap and Laverton tramways. Big thanks to an article by Mike McCarthy in an edition of the Light Railways magazine. I can't remember which one off the top of my head. It was about a year ago it was published, but yeah, it just became freely available to download online, so I did download. And it contained wonderful maps, which I have taken full advantage of. So yeah, you can see that on my All Lines map, which I might as well put into the chat while we're at it. Whoops. Oops. Okay. Yeah. So before we go any further, I'm only still seeing messages from myself and Gerard. So if there are other messages in the chat which I can't see, somebody better let me know via another means. Otherwise, yeah, we'll have to deal with that. Actually, give me a sec. I can see a message from Rod Smith. All right. That's enough for me to just say that, yep. If those are the only two people in the chat at the moment, then that's unusual, but we will continue on. Assuming that that is the case, that there's no technical issues that I don't know about. All right, so getting to the main topic of tonight is the myth, of electrification. And so what is this myth that I refer to? Well, the myth is that to have a proper suburban or decent, like high-class country railway line, you need to have it be electric. Now, this myth I've only really seen it exist in Australia. I'm not sure if it is very present elsewhere in the world, but I've certainly noticed it in Australia and Melbourne and Sydney in particular. Everyone always talks about, oh, you should electrify to Melton or electrify Geelong, when it might not actually make sense to do so. So as we get on, we'll talk about the different forms of electrification, what Melbourne in particular uses and why Melbourne's electric network was once world class, but today is not so much. So electrification in Melbourne was only available for passengers since 1919. I think it might have been 1918 that they started testing of electric trains, but it was considered as early as 1896, but was pretty much just put off by World War One. I know World War One didn't start until about 10 years or so after 1896, but still. So a report in 1908 recommended that Melbourne adopts the 800 volts DC third rail system, and that was a pretty common standard at the time. There was a few different competing standards at the time, but 800 volts third rail was a decent one. However, a later report from the same people in 1912 recommended we adopt the 1,500 volts DC overhead method of electrification. And that's exactly what we did. But yeah, as I said before, it was progress was delayed because of World War One, real lack of materials and commitment to that sort of thing. The steam-hauled railways of Melbourne at the time were doing just fine. So, yeah, but Melbourne in 1919 became the first in Australia to open an electric line. And it was, of course, from Broadmeadows in the north to Sandringham in the south. And I catch the Sandringham line regularly. I'm sure there's some of you out there who catch the Broadmeadows line quite regularly. So there you go. You were actually, well, it was the Broadmeadows line, that's correct, but it was actually from Essendon, the first part of electrification that opened. Okay, I'm sort of going to backtrack a little bit. The first public section was indeed from Broadmeadows from Essendon, to Sandringham, and that was where the first official electric train to the public ran. However, the Showgrounds line, or Flemington Racecourse line, really, that was where the first true electric trains ran in Australia. They only ran there in the early days as tests, but because, even to this day, the line doesn't have an everyday passenger service. But yeah, it was a good, quiet place to do testing of electrification. And so, yeah. Jared asks, when is South Gippsland Hike coming out? I believe that the trailer is coming out on Fogarty Avenue on Sunday, and there's going to be a documentary type thing coming out on Wednesday, I believe, and then the following Sunday will be the first big part. So yeah, it's taken Les a while to get it together, 4 years, but hey, better late than never. Continuing on, soon after Melbourne adopted electrification, so did Sydney. It was 1926 that Sydney adopted electrification. And so they also adopted the 1,500 volts DC system, same as Melbourne, because the Sydney Railway Commissioners at the time were very concerned to not have a repeat of the break of gauge incidents that they'd been battling for the past, 70 odd years by that point. And I sort of chuckle there because it was Melbourne and Sydney's electric networks have never met, and for that matter, no other electric systems have met in Australia. But it was good to see forward thinking, and we must commend that. But you just wish that they had the same attitude towards gauge. Even in 1926, it could have been. There was still a lot of railways yet to be built. It could have been reversed so much easier. Anyway, the next major milestone is in the 1950s, and that is when Melbourne and, Victoria and New South Wales both start to really expand their network. Melbourne and Sydney, up until this point, they had both electrified a number of suburban lines, but they hadn't really expanded beyond that. Famously, Melbourne extended their electrification all the way to Traralgon on the Gippsland line, and in Sydney they extended it throughout the Hunter Valley region and up to Newcastle as well, and what all of these lines had in common was that they were all hauling coal. And that's where the biggest misconception of electrification, of mass electrification, happens with a lot of railway enthusiasts, is that they see electrification as a passenger-focused thing, when really the big expansions of the 50s were all due to coal traffic. Now, why electrify in the first place? Why not just have diesel? Doesn't diesel work? Well, yes, diesel works. Diesel works well. But in the 50s especially, diesel was only just getting started, really, and they weren't really too sure of the full potential of diesel. Steam was well established, but it was, let's just say, it was starting to show its inadequacies. And especially if you looked elsewhere in the world, you could see that steam was on its way out. But Melbourne and Sydney both electrified relatively large swaths of lines. Sydney did it more than New South Wales, I should say, did it more so than Victoria did, primarily because the Hunter Valley region has a lot more coal than the Latrobe Valley region in Victoria, and also because their main port of export was in Newcastle for the coal. G'day, Andrew. So, yeah, that was that. And this is where Melbourne and Sydney start to really differ, and that is because Sydney, I keep saying Sydney, if I say Sydney or Melbourne, I mean Victoria or New South Wales. They decided that both Victoria and New South Wales needed new electric rolling stock. However, Victoria decided to primarily go down the locomotive route and order electric locomotives that could both haul freight services but also passenger services as well. And we had the E-class electrics before that, which were sort of primarily used around suburban freight runs. They made it out to Gippsland a bit, but Gippsland was very much dominated by the newer L-class of electric locomotives. And Sydney also built a few classes of electric locomotives, but again, Sydney's coal traffic has always been greater than Victoria's, and really the whole reason for developing the Latrobe Valley was for Victoria to stop becoming reliant on New South Wales for coal. But yeah, we certainly didn't have a lot of black coal, a little bit in Wonthaggi, but there was never electrification to Wonthaggi. But the Latrobe Valley, for brown coal, we had a lot of that. Now, I said that Sydney built some electric locomotives as well as Victoria. However, when Sydney needed new passenger rolling stock, instead of building carriages that could be hauled by electric locomotives, they preferred to go down the route of electric multiple units. And so that would really set the precedent for why even today you see that Sydney and New South Wales has a much larger electric network remaining than Victoria does. And that's primarily because they chose to do electric multiple units, whereas Victoria chose to do electric locomotives. And just to make that more clear as to why that's a big difference, when the electric locomotives needed upgrading, it was fine to just swap on a diesel and the carriages were all right. But with an electric multiple unit, you've got to replace both the carriages and the motive power at the same time. So it gets expensive, and there's obviously going to be a bit of overlap in the models of the earliest electric sets and the later electric multiple units. So in other words, you don't have that gap in time where diesel could potentially just take over and you don't have further electric multiple unit orders or anything like that. Victoria, just as a little side note, did consider modifying a Comenge train to run out to Warragul. And a few Comenges and Tates and whatever made it out to Warragul and Traralgon on special services, but there was never really any regular EMU services to Warragul and Traralgon. But yeah, the Comenge experiment failed. I believe that the prototype still exists and is sitting out in the open, I'm pretty sure, in East Block of Newport Workshops. It would be nice if I could get access and take some photos, but that's probably not going to happen. Yeah, the biggest New South Wales has definitely reduced their electric network, and Melbourne has cut back its electrification to Pakenham on the Gippsland line, and we have seen occasional extensions of electric suburban services. For example, from Epping to Mernda, which was the most recent one, St Albans to Sunbury. Yeah, all of these, there's been a few random electrifications here and there, but it's always been extensions of the existing suburban network. So that's why electrification in that area made sense, was so that suburban trains could run out to that region and therefore serve more people, and we didn't need to invest. It was cheaper than investing in a suburban orientated diesel multiple unit, for example. G'day, Griffin. Rod Smith says late 1950s New South Wales was to Lithgow, Bowen Fells, and to Gosford for general freight and commuting. Newcastle came much later and was for general freight and commuting. Oh, okay. I thought it was for coal, but there you go. Yeah, the point is that those small electrifications of Melbourne made sense, but yeah, it was always just extending existing services so that you didn't have to order new rolling stock. Now, let's just jump forward a little bit and then we'll come back to Melbourne and Sydney and the likes. So, other states in Australia, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, Tasmania never electrified. They just closed their railways instead, or at least closed to passengers. Yeah, they all. So Adelaide was the most recently electrified, only in the past 10 odd years, maybe. I don't know off the top of my head, but Brisbane and Perth were both in the late 70s to 1980s. And because they were, there's a 50-year gap, they did not use the 1500 volts DC system for two reasons. Number one, they had the hindsight, or I guess just the knowledge that, Melbourne and Sydney haven't been connected electric networks, so it's unlikely that we will see electric connections between other capital cities, and so they weren't too worried about another breaker gauge type incident. And as a quick side note, yes, perhaps we'll see it one day, but I still think it's a while off. Anyway, they both Perth and Brisbane, later extensions from those two cities, they used the much more modern 25 kilovolts AC system. Now, we get on to that second reason that they chose 25 kilovolts AC is because of the way that electricity works. The two most important concepts that you need to understand about electricity transmission is the difference between AC and DC, and then power loss and how it is proportional to voltage or current, I should say. We'll get to that. Firstly, DC versus AC. What do I mean? DC is direct current, AC is alternating current. And you probably know the difference, but just so we're all clear, direct current is like you get from a battery. If you imagine a circuit, the electricity always flows in the one direction. And then it's pretty much set at a voltage, and that voltage doesn't change. In AC, alternating current, the electricity goes around one way and then goes around the other way. Then one way, other way. It alternates. Alternating current, who would have guessed? But the reason that makes a difference is because it's much easier to boost the voltage or decrease the voltage of AC power than it is of DC. And that's because of complicated physics that Nikola Tesla discovered for us. But yeah, all you need to know is that it's much easier to boost AC than it is DC. It's absolutely possible with DC. It's just a bit more difficult. It's not as efficient. Now, why would you want to boost the voltage when all of your system is running at the same voltage anyway? So what's the need? Well, power loss in a wire is measured, the formula for that is the resistance of the wire times the current squared. Now, I know that might seem a bit complicated to some people, but basically all you need to know is that you can't change the resistance of the wire, but you can change the current. Electrical power is voltage times current, so they're interchangeable. If you've got, for the same level of power, you can have more current and less voltage, or more voltage, less current. But the amount of power that you lose over the length of some wire is just proportional to the current squared. And that squared really makes a big difference, because that means, let's just say, for example's sake, you've got a resistance of 1 and a current of 1. Well, that means that your power loss is 1. Great. Let's increase that to 2 amps, for example. Well, cool. Now you've got 2 amps of current loss. Now let's increase that to 4. Uh-oh. Now you've got 8 amps of current loss. Or sorry, I'm even mixing it up. 4 squared is 16, so you've got 16 watts of current loss over the 1 ohm wire. And in the 2 amp example, you've got a power loss of 4 watts. So you can see that the power loss goes up exponentially as the current increases. That's the really important concept to grasp, is that you want to keep the current as low as possible. In other words, you want to keep the voltage as high as possible. Now you start to see why 25 kilovolts is a lot better than 1,500 volts, even though, yeah, we're used to 240 volts in the homes of Australia, and pretty much everywhere else in the world apart from the US and maybe a couple of other places. But even then, you'll find that the big power transmission lines are all operating at much higher voltages. Why is that? To reduce power loss. And yes, Rod has just put in a little rhyme, if you like, to remember the power loss formula. But unless you're studying physics or something like that, or electrical engineering, you probably don't need to remember the formula. But yeah. So combined with those two facts that we've just discussed, that higher voltage means less power loss, and AC alternating current means that you can much more easily boost the voltage to higher levels. That combines to mean that the infrastructure for 25 kilovolts AC is a lot cheaper to build and maintain for long distances than 1,500 volts DC. Now, an obvious question would be, okay, so why not do 1,000,000 volts or 1,000,000,000 volts? If more volts is better, why not just increase it to infinity? Well, physics gets in our way again, and if we go too far, then if the wires are placed too close together, then there's potential for the voltage to jump across the two wires, and that would obviously not be good, a great big spark in the air. You still see occasionally relatively small sparks going from the wire to the pantograph if it's disconnected a little bit, but what you want to avoid is the two wires sparking out on each other. So 25 kilovolts AC is the world standard accepted limit for railways for electrification. Why didn't we adopt 25 kilovolts AC back in the early 20th century when Sydney and Melbourne were first electrifying their lines? Well, because at the time there was still the debate hadn't been settled whether we wanted to use DC or AC power for our grids. And you'll find that at the time, Victoria or New South Wales in themselves had many different mixed electrical networks of different voltages, and some were AC, some were DC, some were both. And in fact, the Victorian Railways built their own power station to operate their electric railways in the early days. And so, yeah. Melbourne and Sydney's electric railway networks, they were modern for their time, but times have changed, and they're almost too ahead of their time, if that makes sense. Anyway, so I don't think that Perth, there's much electrification beyond Perth, really, but there is certainly a lot of electrification beyond Brisbane. you'll find that electric wires extend north all the way to Rockhampton, and then west as far as Emerald. And again, that's mostly for the haulage of coal traffic from Emerald to Rockhampton, but general freight as well. Especially Brisbane to Rockhampton. And Brisbane to Rockhampton is, of course, run by electric multiple units. Has been since pretty much it was electrified. And so, yeah. Rod Smith says 25 kilovolts AC was still experimental in the 1940s. Their first major installations were approximately in the 1950s, but then after that, standard swept the world. There were 3 mineral lines on 50 kilovolts AC, but only one survives. Interesting. Very interesting. So, yeah, I think that 50 kilovolts AC would perhaps be better suited for single track lines, whereas 25 kilovolts is more suited for double track lines. Could be wrong though. So yeah, I don't think there's ever been electric services to Emerald, electric passenger services, I should say, because all the trains that have run out of Rockhampton have all been long distance ones that were going to much further than Emerald. But yeah, I'm not entirely certain on that. Yeah, so if we go back to Melbourne and Sydney and look at going forward for both cities, what can we do? Should we switch to 25 kilovolts AC? Short answer, no. It's best to just keep going with what we've got. If you start, because the main reason being, if you're going to convert it all at once, and apart from that, you start to run into equivalent problems of break of gauge, and it's not quite as bad because electric systems can be configured to run on multiple different voltages, but it's a huge difference between 25 kilovolts AC and 1,500 volts DC. So ultimately, there's a lot of expense in making something that runs on both. You'd essentially end up with the worst of both worlds, and you never want a situation like that. So it's just too cost prohibitive to change everything over, and it wouldn't serve that much benefit. Yeah, so going back to calls for electrification, to the most common two that I hear about is Melton and Geelong. So I think we'll focus on Melton first. Yes, I think that Melton is a good candidate for electrification. And in fact, I would extend it one stop further to Bacchus Marsh. Because that way you can extend existing suburban services, use existing suburban rolling stock, or perhaps just order more of the same design. Bacchus Marsh, if you look at the V-line trains that serve Bacchus Marsh today, is mostly effectively suburban commuters. And Ballarat and Geelong to a certain extent as well, but I've discussed in the previous live stream about short, medium and long distance rolling stock and how I think that should be more separated in Victoria at least. But yeah, in terms of going further to Geelong or Ballarat or something, I don't really hear often calls of electrify to Ballarat or Bendigo or anything like that. If anything, you'll get re-electrified to Traralgon more often than that. And I guess I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But Geelong, I don't see it being electrified because it's just diesel trains would work fine, and there's no. I guess there's a misconception that electric trains are faster when, yes, perhaps that was true in the early days of diesel and steam and whatnot, but certainly not these days. Electric trains might be marginally faster than diesel, but and faster only in terms of acceleration. Melbourne's, I believe all of Melbourne's suburban trains are rated to run up to 130 kilometres an hour. I believe they've all been tested as fast as 140 kilometres an hour. Maybe a little bit more than that. It's usually a 10% more. But they're only authorised in service to go 115 max speed, and that even includes the new HCMTs, which are currently undergoing high-speed testing up to 140 k's an hour or a little bit more. So yeah, given that you contrast that with the velocity sets, which as much as we love to hate velocities, they can go 160. So unless you designed electric trains to go 160, it would almost be a downgrade for Ballarat and Geelong commuters. Having said that, I don't think that necessarily diesel multiple unit is the best design. I think the XPT or Spirit of Queensland style locomotives at either end with carriages, I think that's a better design. And for that matter, I think that the Spirit of Queensland is a train that should be modelled by other states as a good, modern, fast train on bad tracks. Or, not the best tracks, because, hello, it can tilt. And it managed to speed up the Cairns service from, it was like 36 hours down to 26. So, yeah, big difference. Of course, you're not going to, if the journey doesn't take 36 hours and it only normally takes 2 hours on normal trains, then you might be able to only reduce that 10-20 minutes, but even still, that's an improvement. So and that goes for the Gippsland line as well. I would rather see money invested in better diesel trains than electric, because it's just too cost prohibitive to maintain that length of 1,500 volts DC system when you don't have the frequency of services, and B, the general freight traffic. I think that even if they said that electric freight services could operate, I doubt that Cube or whoever was running the Mary Rail paper train, which is currently the only freight train which operates on the Gippsland line at the moment, I don't see them investing in an electric locomotive, given their reluctance to invest in any sort of new diesel locomotive to begin with. So, yeah, all I see with Melbourne's electric network is that it will be slowly expanded. And just while we're on the topic of electrifying to Melton and that sort of thing, I think that Windvale will be another candidate for electrification. And that was supposed to be designed with provisions for that. With provision, and by that I mean provisions for the two side platforms to be turned into island platforms. But I believe that got cut from the final design scope of the stations, which was a bit of a stupid move by the government at the time. But hey, when has the government got a rail project right? Hardly ever in Victoria. And yeah, in terms of, I also hear occasionally people say, electrify to Hillsville again. Well, not again, it was never electrified in the first place, but, reopen the line to Hillsville and run electric trains out there. Same with Warburton, same with Whittlesea. I'm not necessarily against those lines being reopened, but if they are going to be reopened, only with diesel trains, except perhaps for Whittlesea, I think that could do with electric trains. Not that Whittlesea has a huge population, but we've gone as far as Mernda, and that's sort of where the limit of suburban growth is today. But I really think that they should have gone a bit further, preferably all the way to Whittlesea, but even a little, just like one stop further than Mernda, because then that would encourage further growth in the region. There's often the attitude of politicians of the demand has to be there first for the infrastructure to be built, whereas in reality it sort of should be the other way around. The infrastructure should be built, which then creates the demand or enables the demand almost. But yeah, that's a real discussion for another day. And in terms of, I'll discuss another day in depth reopening lines and rail trails and whatnot. I know I keep promising an episode on rail trails, so probably won't be my next live episode, but maybe the one after that. And I guess a final mention of Adelaide. I see Adelaide continuing to expand its electric network. They have a mix of electric multiple units and diesel multiple units running suburban services. They don't have any country services running. And Perth has a couple of regional services, but again, they're diesel multiple units. In fact, the Adelaide's only electric trains are running. They are of an evolved design of Victoria's original Velocity trains. So there you go. And I guess one little final thing, since we've got another 5 minutes remaining, dual power. In fact, there's two things I want to mention. Firstly is dual power. Second is HCMTs, because they do something a bit different to other trains in Melbourne in terms of their electric systems. But firstly, the dual power trains, so ability to run on both electric and diesel. I believe New South Wales is or was considering it for their updated XPT. Come to think of it, I can't remember whether it was ditched entirely or if it's still on the cards. I have a feeling it was ditched. But it's an interesting concept to be able to run on electric power in electric areas and diesel in non-electric areas. I think that it's a tough one because you'd have to look at the extra expense of running a dual power system, the complexities of that, and the more complex a system is, the more potential for unreliability there is. And so, yeah, I think that if anyone was going to order one, just be careful what you wish for. And yeah, are you saving that much money in the long run? Because yes, electricity is cheaper than diesel if you've got the infrastructure already in place, but it's not a clear-cut answer, put it that way. Rod Smith says the original concept for a Werribee to Wyndham Vale electric line, but the federal government wouldn't contribute. Odds on Melton as stage 1 and Bacchus Marsh as stage 2. Wallen, Whittlesea. Yeah, I think that's right. I forgot Wallen. I think Wallen will get electrified again because it's an extension of existing suburban services. But I don't see any super long distance electrifications happening in Melbourne or Sydney really anytime soon. Rod also says electro diesel does nothing for New South Wales. UKSR had some, and New York Central did for accessing its terminus via tunnels. Oh yeah. I'd say I'd agree with that. That electro diesel doesn't do anything for New South Wales, and same sort of thing with Victoria. I don't see it doing anything for Victoria. Side note, with the mention of tunnels, velocity trains and diesel locomotives, for that matter, have run through the loop a few times. Every so often, a velocity gets redirected into the loop for various reasons. But yeah, the city loop in Melbourne has the ability to handle diesel trains, but you just don't regularly see them. The exhaust systems are designed for a fire, so they can manage a few diesel fumes. Yes. And so the final thing that I'd like to mention, given that we've just ticked over the hour mark, is HCMT, the new Melbourne electric trains. The thing that they do differently to the rest of Melbourne trains is that although at the pantographs they are running off of the standard 1,500 volts DC of Melbourne, at the motors are actually running off of 3,000 volts DC. I believe it's DC, not AC. It's quite possibly AC actually, now that I think about it, but we'll assume it's definitely 3,000 volts. And I heard, I was talking with about electrification with another rail fan the other day, and they said, oh, well, it'd be easy for Melbourne to upgrade to a higher voltage. Look, the HCMTs are doing it. They're running their motors at 3,000 volts. And so I explained to him that, yes, that makes some difference in that you perhaps use less copper wire because the wires don't need to be as thick if you're running off of a higher voltage. But ultimately, you're not saving that much money because the main expense in electrification and the reason that higher voltage is preferred is because of the transmission, not the rolling stock itself. That doesn't really make a big difference. And yeah, diesel electric locomotives, while I just randomly think of them, their motors operate at various different voltages. I don't think there's any real standard for that. It just sort of depends on the application, the exact details of the application. Anyway, unless anyone has any further comments, I think we'll end it off here. We've got 6 people still watching and 8 likes, which is always nice. In terms of any more videos which are coming out from me, I'm just really busy with uni, so I haven't really had much time to edit any videos. You're not going to see one tomorrow, put it that way. You might see one during the week, or it might be Sunday, or it might not even be then. But ultimately, my exams finish by late October. I think it's the 25th or the 26th of October, something like that. So after that, I'll have a lot more time to edit videos and stuff. So we should return back to regular programming after that. But yeah, you will have to endure a couple more weeks of me being caught up with uni. But hey, that's the reality. Studies take priority, as I hope they should for anyone watching these videos of mine. Anyway, no further comments, so I will end it off here. Thanks for watching. As I said, next live stream, I think I will do double-decker trains. I'll just be discussing that. Melbourne versus Sydney, why double-decks have failed to really take off in Melbourne. So yeah, that should be a good one. And then the week after that, we'll do reopening rails and rail trails and stuff. All right, cheers. See you later.